How did a routine dentist appointment turn into a deadly mystery? Hercule Poirot went in for a simple checkup, but an hour later, Dr. Morley was found dead. Suicide or murder? Matais. A gleaming revolver on the table, hidden blood on the chair, and a missing identity. Everything points to one thing. This wasn't just a death, it was a conspiracy. Can Poirot unmask the killer before it's too late? Or will the truth staring him in the face be his own downfall? Guy. A thrilling mystery that will grip you till the very end. Listen, uncover, and face the truth. It was a bright, ordinary London morning, the kind that almost felt too perfect for the chaos that usually followed. The streets of Queen Charlotte Street bustled with the pulse of the city. Pedestrians hurried by with intent, the click of their shoes echoing against the cobblestones, while the hum of distant conversations blended with the screech of carriage wheels against the pavement. The air, crisp and cool, carried the faint sting of car fumes, mixed with the faint scent of rain, though the clouds hadn't yet decided to make their presence known. But for Hercule Poirot, the renowned Belgian detective, it was all too much like the precision he so desperately craved in his life. As he walked with measured steps, his mind was already a swirl of thought, sharp, calculated, always in perfect order. Today was to be a simple visit to the dentist, Dr. Morley, for a routine checkup. Yet, despite the outward normality, Poirot couldn't shake the sensation that something was terribly off. The day seemed too ordinary, the street too familiar. And as he adjusted the rim of his hat, he felt that curious, familiar tightening in his chest, the kind that came before something profound, something that would turn his life, once again, into a puzzle. A clock tower in the distance struck precisely 11:15 a.m. as Poirot entered the dental clinic. The building itself was unassuming. Nestled between an old bookshop and a tea shop, its brass nameplate glistening softly in the morning light. The polished door handle turned with a satisfying click, and Poirot stepped inside. The clinic was a place of order, everything in its right place. The gentle buzz of a ceiling fan swirled the air, and the scent of antiseptic mingled with the faint aroma of mint toothpaste. Monsieur Poirot, Dr. Morley, jovial as ever, greeted him from behind the counter, his smile wide and sincere. "Come right in. I assure you, this will be painless." Poirot couldn't help but raise a skeptical brow, his finely groomed mustache twitching slightly as he responded with a hint of dry humor. The assurance of a dentist is much like that of a politician, doctor. Rarely trusted. Doctor. Morley chuckled heartily, a rich, unbothered sound, clearly unfazed by Poirot's signature sharp wit. "Nonsense. My patients leave here with smiles as good as new. Come, take a seat." Despite the warmth of the doctor's demeanor, Poirot felt the unease settle deeper. His eyes, ever observant, flickered over the waiting area, few chairs, a small table stacked with magazines, the soft clinking sound of a clock ticking on the wall. It was all too ordinary, too quiet, except for the figures in the room with him. Alistair Blunt, a businessman of some renown, sat with perfect composure in one of the chairs, flipping through a newspaper. His fingers lingered on the edges of the paper, but his gaze was distant, perhaps lost in thought, or perhaps hiding something more. Miss Sainsbury Seal, an anxious woman in her mid-30s, sat on the edge of her chair, her grip tight on her handbag, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Poirot caught the glint of something, tension, perhaps, or fear. The sound of the drill whirred into motion as Dr. Morley prepared the tools. The air was thick with the noise, yet Poirot's mind was sharp, slicing through the clatter as he observed the faintest shift in the atmosphere. The drill's buzz seemed to grow quieter, even though the machine continued its work. He could feel it in the air, as if the very molecules had slowed. Something was amiss. But Poirot couldn't pinpoint what it was. An unsettling silence, like a symphony missing its final note. And then, as if by instinct, Poirot's sharp senses caught something beyond the ordinary. A faint puff of air disturbed the air around him, though no one had moved. He felt it on the back of his neck, the same prickling sensation he had learned to trust as a harbinger of something lurking beneath the surface. The doctor's reassuring presence, The normalcy of the waiting room felt suddenly distant, as if the space around him had grown cold, unnervingly so. The sound of the drill stopped. Poirot, in the midst of the lingering tension, shifted in his chair and glanced around. The moment stretched, the stillness punctuated by the tick-tock of the clock on the wall. In the strange pause, Poirot's eyes landed on a small detail that caused his pulse to quicken. Just for a second, a shadow passed by the window, brief yet definite. Something had shifted. Poirot wasn't sure how or why, but the day was no longer ordinary. It had already begun to unravel, and he could feel it. With a final polite nod to Dr. Morley, Poirot left the clinic and stepped back into the vibrant chaos of London. The bright morning, once so predictable, had already slipped from his grasp like sand through fingers. The street felt colder now, though the air had not changed. He pulled his coat tighter around him and adjusted his hat once more, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. Poirot paid no further attention to the bustling pedestrians as he walked, the rhythmic clack of his shoes on the pavement almost too loud against the low hum of city life. Yet despite his routine walk, something nagged at him, something he couldn't quite grasp, like a tune stuck in his mind, just beyond reach. But it was only an hour later when the world tilted for Hercule Poirot when the news broke, stark and sudden. Dr. Morley was dead. His body found in his office, a revolver in hand, the police immediately declaring it a suicide. Poirot stopped in his tracks, his chest tight. "Suicide," he muttered aloud, his voice a quiet challenge to the news. His mind spun, the words feeling too easy, too simple. His eyes narrowed, a glimmer of certainty flashing behind them. "No, mon ami, this is murder, of that I am sure." Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's eyes gleamed with the glint of a man on the edge of something far greater. The smile that played at the corners of his lips wasn't one of relief or humor. It was the knowing smile of a man who had just stepped into a mystery far more intricate than he ever anticipated. The puzzle had already begun to shift, and Hercule Poirot was about to play his part in solving it. But as he walked away from the clinic, one question echoed in his mind louder than the rest. Why was Dr. Morley's death made to look like a suicidant who stood to gain from it? And with that thought, Poirot's pursuit for truth would begin. But he would soon realize that not everything was as it seemed in the world of smiles and masks. Setting suspense. Hercule Poirot sat in the dentist's chair, his hands folded neatly on his lap, his posture straight, as always. His mustache, so meticulously groomed, seemed to twitch ever so slightly, as if aware of the subtle shift in the room around him. Dr. Morley, jovial as ever, had just settled into his work, but Poirot's sharp mind, never at rest, was already hard at work, dissecting the quiet, unspoken details of the clinic. The light above him flickered just slightly, casting a soft shadow over his face, and Poirot couldn't help but notice the small things that others might miss: the slight creak of the wooden floorboards underfoot, the soft whoosh of air from the ventilation system, the unmistakable scent of fresh wax on the furniture. It was a comfortable place, clinical but homely. Yet, despite the warmth of the environment, something felt amiss. His eyes flicked toward the waiting room, where two other patients sat. Alistair Blunt, a businessman of some renown, sat with his back perfectly straight, the edges of his neatly pressed suit reflecting the precise order of his life. His eyes were absorbed in the newspaper before him, but Poirot knew better than to take this as a sign of ease. There was something about Blunt's calm demeanor, too controlled, almost unnatural, that piqued Poirot's attention. His fingers, gripping the edges of the paper, seemed to twitch ever so slightly, a subtle crack in his otherwise composed exterior. The man was hiding something. Poirot couldn't tell yet what, but he was sure of it. Then there was Miss Sainsbury Seal, the woman sitting across from him. She was fidgeting, her fingers curled tightly around her handbag, clutching it as though it were a lifeline. Her eyes darted nervously between the window and the door, her mouth slightly open as though she were on the verge of speaking but couldn't find the words. Poirot observed the way she shifted in her seat, her movements jerky and uncertain. She was a woman on edge, though he couldn't say whether it was from fear or anticipation or perhaps both. There was a frantic energy in her that didn't sit right, but Poirot couldn't pinpoint why. The sound of the drill hummed to life, and Poirot's mind narrowed to the rhythmic whir of the instrument, feeling its vibrations reverberate deep into his bones. He closed his eyes for a moment, letting the noise wash over him, and yet, despite the steady hum, a quiet unease began to creep into the air, a silence too thick to ignore. The drill's noise softened, as if someone had suddenly turned down its volume, though Poirot knew that wasn't possible. "Doctor." Morley's hands worked steadily on Poirot's teeth, yet the room seemed to hold its breath. Time stretched for a moment, like a moment frozen in time, where each tick of the clock was exaggerated in Poirot's ears. The hum of the room faded, as though muffled by a strange fog, and Poirot's senses sharpened. His sharp eyes scanned the room, his mind calculating, observing. Miss Sainsbury Seal's nervous breathing was now too loud, in the otherwise quiet room, her chest rising and falling erratically. The clasp of her handbag creaked as she gripped it tighter, as though trying to contain something or perhaps hide something. Her lips parted slightly, and Poirot caught the faintest whisper of her words, just audible over the silence. "I don't like this place. I don't like it." Poirot's brow furrowed slightly. Was she speaking to herself, or to someone else? She had glanced toward Alistair Blunt, but he was absorbed in his newspaper, his eyes scanning the print as if nothing was wrong. And yet, something about the way his gaze never lingered too long on any one page made Poirot uneasy. The drill's hum faded into silence, leaving only the steady ticking of the clock. Poirot's attention was drawn to the stillness, an absence that was far more telling than the noise had ever been. The sudden silence felt like a warning. A pressure filled the room, squeezing Poirot's chest, and despite his usual composure, he felt it to a sense of foreboding. Poirot's sharp gaze turned to Miss Sainsbury Seal again. Her fingers, once tightly clutching her handbag, were now trembling. Her eyes darted to Dr. Morley, and for a brief moment, Poirot could see something in her eyes, a reflection of something that could only be described as fear. But why fear? What had she seen or thought that made her so frightened in this otherwise mundane setting? He felt the air grow colder, a chill creeping through the room, the hum of the world outside slipping away. His gaze shifted to Blunt once more, but his eyes were narrowed, his body too still. There was a sharpness to his features now that Poirot hadn't noticed before, an edge, as though Blunt too felt the shift in the room. Poirot's pulse quickened. Was it only in his mind, or had the atmosphere truly changed? His sharp, calculating mind raced to make sense of the sudden tension, but just as he was about to speak, a distant, almost imperceptible noise came from the back of the clinic. A faint shuffle, a creak. Poirot's eyes flicked toward the source of the sound, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. The drill's hum began again, louder now, returning the room to its earlier noise, but the weight of the silence still lingered. Something had happened, something unspoken. Poirot was sure of it now. The threads of suspicion had been tugged, and he knew that this clinic, this seemingly innocent visit, was not as it seemed. Cliffhanger ending. Just as Dr. Morley leaned in, adjusting his tools to continue his work, Poirot's sharp gaze caught sight of something, the slip of paper caught in the corner of the clinic's desk, just visible enough to be noticed. His eyes locked onto it, a wave of realization sweeping over him. Something was out of place. Someone had left that note there, and Poirot knew, without a doubt, that it was meant for him. What was it? Why was it there? Poirot's thoughts raced, and his instincts screamed that he was already standing at the precipice of something far darker than he could have ever expected. But before he could reach for the paper, the door to the back office creaked open. Dr. Morley looked up, his face suddenly drained of color, and Poirot's world shifted once again. Cliffhanger. Poirot stepped out of the dentist's clinic and onto Queen Charlotte Street, the familiar London bustle swirling around him. The air was brisk, biting at his cheeks, but his mind was elsewhere. He adjusted his hat, flicking a glance over his shoulder at the clinic's door, half expecting to see something out of place, but no. Everything appeared normal, as it should. The noise of the city felt oddly distant, as if the world were holding its breath. He paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the street. There was something in the atmosphere now that hadn't been there when he'd first entered the clinic. A sense of unease settled over him. His steps were deliberate, each one in rhythm with the ticking of the clock tower above. It was a routine day, an ordinary one, surely. There was no reason for the lingering sense of disquiet that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. No reason at all. Poirot had long learned to trust his instincts, though, and right now, they were telling him that today was anything but ordinary. He walked to his destination, but the nagging feeling in the back of his mind refused to be silenced. In a city so full of life, the mundane seemed all the more sinister, as if hidden under layers of routine was something darker, something waiting to be uncovered. And Poirot, for all his meticulousness and precision, could not shake the sensation that something was already unraveling beneath his feet. An hour passed. Poirot was sitting in his study, sipping tea, when the knock on his door came. It was sharp, insistent, and as Poirot rose to open it, his mind briefly wondered what could possibly have shaken the steadiness of his day. His butler, Hastings, stood in the doorway, his face a mask of disbelief. "Poirot," Hastings said in a low voice, his eyes wide with shock. "You must hear this. It's terrible news. Dr. Morley, he's dead." Poirot's heart skipped a beat, the rhythmic thud of his pulse suddenly too loud in his ears. He had just seen the man just hours ago, a cheerful, jovial fellow with a kind demeanor. He had laughed off Poirot's jokes, assured him the appointment would be painless, and yet, now, "Dead," Poirot repeated, his voice flat, though his mind was already racing. "How?" "Suicide," Hastings answered, his voice strained, disbelief still hanging in the air. "The papers say he took his own life, shot himself in his office." "Suicide," Hastings answered, his voice strained, disbelief still hanging in the air. "The papers say he took his own life, shot himself in his office." Poirot froze. He could hear the words clearly, but they didn't make sense. The man he had just spoken with, the one who had exuded warmth and cheerfulness, who had dismissed Poirot's concerns with a light laugh, no. It didn't add up. It couldn't be true. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his hand tightening around his teacup. "Suicide," he muttered, his voice low and filled with something other than disbelief. It was a feeling Poirot knew too well. A feeling that came before everything else, the hint of something hidden beneath the surface. He paced slowly around the room, his fingers drumming a quiet rhythm on the edge of his desk. "No, mon ami. This is not suicide. This is murder. Of that I am sure." Hastings looked at him, puzzled. "But Poirot, the police, they believe it's an open and shut case." Poirot stopped pacing and turned sharply to face his friend. His eyes gleamed with a rare intensity, his usual calm now laced with an undercurrent of suspicion. "Hastings, there are details here that do not align with the picture the world has chosen to see. A man does not simply turn from jovial to a corpse in an instant. There is something hidden, something that someone is not telling." Poirot's mind whirred, going back over every interaction with Dr. Morley. The clinic, the patients, the fleeting moments of unease he had dismissed. He thought back to the odd feeling that had settled over him as he left, the strange, almost imperceptible shift in the room. Was it possible that he had been so focused on the obvious that he had missed the deeper, more dangerous currents beneath the surface? "And what of the note?" Poirot said suddenly, as if a light bulb had gone off. "The note in the clinic's desk. Who would leave such a thing behind, and why? Was it meant for me? Was it a clue to what truly happened?" Hastings opened his mouth to speak, but Poirot cut him off. His mind was racing, too fast for words to catch up. "We must go to the clinic. I need to see Dr. Morley's office. There are subtle things that I may have missed before. Only they can reveal the truth." As Poirot grabbed his coat and hat, Hastings could only watch as his friend's face grew darker, his eyes more focused. Poirot wasn't the type to simply dismiss things. His mind, always sharp and calculating, now buzzed with questions. He had seen the clues, felt the strange tension, and now, with Dr. Morley's death. Everything felt connected in a way that felt both unsettling and dangerously close to the edge of something much larger. Dr. Morley's death. Everything felt connected in a way that felt both unsettling and dangerously close to the edge of something much larger. Poirot paused at the door, his hand on the handle. He turned to Hastings, his voice colder than it had been in years. "If this is truly suicide," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "then I am not Hercule Poirot." With that, he stepped into the darkening streets, ready to uncover the secrets that no one else dared to face. Cliffhanger ending. As Poirot and Hastings arrived at the clinic, Poirot's instincts kicked into overdrive. He stepped inside, his mind already racing ahead. He looked around, his gaze darting from the desk to the faint smudge of something just out of place. There it was, a faint, almost imperceptible mark on the floor. A clue too small for anyone else to notice, but Poirot knew it was the key to everything. Just as Poirot bent to examine it, a noise behind him froze him in his tracks. The door to Dr. Morley's office creaked open, and Poirot's hand instinctively reached for the door frame. But there was no one there. The silence was broken only by the soft whisper of the wind, and Poirot's heart skipped a beat. What had he missed? The investigation begins. Poirot and Hastings returned to the clinic under a heavy sky. The bustling street had turned silent in the shadow of tragedy, as the police swarmed the building. Red and blue lights flashed through the windows, their chaotic dance giving the whole scene an unsettling, almost surreal quality. Poirot's mind was sharp, more alert than ever. The clinic that had felt so ordinary mere hours ago now appeared alien hostile. His boots echoed against the cold marble floor as he stepped inside, his eyes immediately scanning the scene. The familiar antiseptic scent of the clinic mingled with the heavier, more pungent aroma of fear. Chief Inspector Japp stood near the entrance, looking stern, his face set in a permanent frown. The detective's eyes met Poirot's, a flicker of recognition passing between them. Japp's expression, however, remained unchanged, a mixture of irritation and skepticism. He had little time for Poirot's unconventional methods, but in matters of murder, even he could not ignore the Belgian detective's uncanny ability to see things others missed. "Poirot." Japp greeted him curtly, not bothering with pleasantries. "Back again, I see. You don't waste any time when a body's involved, do you?" Poirot's expression remained cool, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. "I am here to help, mon ami. But I fear you have already decided on the conclusion." His gaze swept over the room-mover, the bloodstains, the broken chair, the open window, and the overturned desk, taking in every detail. Japp let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Suicide, Poirot. The man killed himself. There's no mystery here. His office was locked from the inside, the revolver found in his hand. What more do you need?" Poirot stepped forward, his movements precise, his face unreadable. "The more I need, Chief Inspector, is the truth. And sometimes, the truth is not what appears to be at first glance." Japp's jaw tightened. "And what is it you suspect, Poirot? That someone forced him to pull the trigger?" Poirot's eyes flicked toward the shattered window, then back to the lifeless body of Dr. Morley. "It is not the how that troubles me, mon ami. It is the why, Doctor. Morley was a man who seemed at peace with himself, yes. He had no signs of distress. And yet, an hour later, he is found dead. The clues do not align." Japp shook his head, clearly frustrated. "Poirot, don't start with your theatrics. There's nothing more to find here." But Poirot remained calm, his eyes scanning the room with a renewed sense of purpose. Every inch of the office had a story to tell, and Poirot was determined to uncover it. He approached the desk, bending down to examine the fallen papers scattered across the floor. One, in particular, caught his attention. A letter. It was neatly folded, but its edges were frayed, as though it had been hastily crumpled. Poirot lifted it delicately, reading the ink-smeared message. There was something about it that seemed wrong. "This," Poirot muttered to himself, "this is not a letter from someone who has decided to end their own life. No, no, no." His voice was barely a whisper, but Japp, hovering nearby, caught every word. "What's that?" Japp asked, his tone now more serious. Poirot didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned the paper over, revealing a name he hadn't expected to see here, not in connection with this case. His mind began to race, the pieces of the puzzle starting to fit together, but not in the way he had expected. This letter, Poirot continued, was written by someone trying to tell us something, and I believe it was meant for me. Japp's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to Poirot. You're reading too much into it. There's no conspiracy here. A man killed himself. End of story. But Poirot was already walking toward the window, his eyes trained on the darkening street below. No, Japp, this is only the beginning. He turned back to face his old colleague, his voice quieter, but edged with urgency. You see, there are no accidents, no random deaths. Every detail has its meaning, even the smallest clue. That window, for example. It has been opened, but not in the way a man would do when he's about to end his life. Japp followed Poirot's gaze. The window was slightly ajar, a faint breeze stirring the drapes. The room was stifling, yet the window had been opened just enough for the air to flow through. But Poirot's mind was already beyond the physical space. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, but it wasn't the one he expected. This is no ordinary case, Chief Inspector, Poirot continued, his voice low, his gaze intense. This is a message from someone who is trying to make sure we all misunderstand what truly happened here. Poirot's mind was a storm of calculations and theories. He could feel the dark energy of the clinic pulling him deeper, beckoning him to uncover its secrets. And yet, in that moment, Poirot understood something even more chilling. This case was not merely about a man's death. It was about something far bigger. Something that would take him to places he had never imagined. The air seemed to thicken as Poirot stood still, his mind working faster than his feet could follow. He had seen something beyond the obvious. He had found a thread, a thin, fragile thread that could unravel everything. And Poirot knew better than anyone. Once you pull a thread in a case like this, there's no turning back. Key clue. A faint trace of powder on the desk catches Poirot's attention. Poirot stood over the desk, his brow furrowed, as his keen eyes observed the details others might have missed. The room, still thick with the scent of antiseptic and the remnants of shock, seemed eerily silent now that the initial wave of activity had passed. A single faint trace of white powder caught his attention, barely visible, but unmistakable to his trained eye. Poirot leaned forward, his fingers delicately grazing the surface of the desk. It was as if the powder had been hastily wiped away, but not completely erased. What was it? A chemical residue. Something used in the office, or something far more sinister. He turned to Hastings, who had been quietly observing, yet clearly aware that the detective's mind was already piecing together the puzzle. Hastings. Poirot murmured, this powder, it is not merely an accident. It speaks of something deliberate. Hastings looked at the faint trace, a confused expression clouding his face. But Poirot, what could it mean? Poirot didn't answer right away. Instead, he allowed the silence to settle around them, a silence that felt heavy with anticipation. The powder was just the beginning. The clinic had returned to its quiet, methodical rhythm, but Poirot knew better than to assume there was nothing more to discover. It is time, Poirot said, straightening up, to learn more about the people who walked through these doors. Poirot interviews the staff and learns. Poirot, with his sharp and subtle manner, began his questioning. Miss Sainsbury Seal, a nervous woman with hands that fidgeted incessantly, seemed to avoid his gaze as he questioned her. Miss Seal, Poirot inquired, his tone gentle but insistent. Did you see anything unusual today? Anything at all that might suggest Dr. Morley was in danger? The woman, who had been clutching her handbag nervously in her lap, shifted uneasily. Didn't see anything, Monsieur Poirot. It's just, I had a bad feeling. You know, sometimes you get that feeling. A bad omen, perhaps. So, I left hurriedly. Poirot raised an eyebrow, intrigued by her sudden departure. You left in a rush. That is not like someone in good health, no. A mysterious feeling. Perhaps it is not a coincidence. Miss Seal's hands tightened around her bag. She had not answered his question directly, but Poirot could see the unease written across her face. He made a mental note of her behavior. It was far too telling for him to overlook. He moved on to the other staff, his questions methodical. He learned nothing that changed his course. Dr. Morley had been a man with no apparent financial or personal troubles. His colleagues respected him, and no one could imagine him being involved in anything shady. Yet the stark truth remained. Someone had wanted him dead. Poirot discovers that Alistair Blunt, the powerful banker, was one of the last patients seen by Dr. Morley. Was Blunt the true target? Poirot's mind raced as he pieced together the facts, his usual calm demeanor beginning to crack under the pressure. Something didn't sit right. Alistair Blunt, the powerful banker, was one of the last patients Dr. Morley had seen. A man of power, wealth, and influence, and yet there he was, slipping through the cracks of this investigation like an unnoticed shadow. Poirot's gaze turned back toward Hastings, a look of deep suspicion in his eyes. "Hastings," he said softly, "there is more to this, much more. What if Dr. Morley was not the true target?" Hastings looked perplexed. "But Poirot, Blunt has no connection to the murder, surely?" Poirot's voice grew colder, more deliberate. "We cannot rule anything out, my friend. A man with power often makes enemies, enemies who would stop at nothing to see him fall. What if Dr. Morley was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time? What if the real target was someone else entirely?" Poirot's eyes flickered over the evidence, the strange powder, the hastily scribbled letters, the odd behavior of the clinic's patients. The puzzle pieces were falling into place, but they were not forming the image Poirot had initially expected. Alistair Blunt, so calm, so composed, what was his role in all of this? Poirot couldn't ignore the subtle threads weaving through this case, threads that all seemed to lead back to him. The thought struck Poirot like a bolt of lightning, leaving him chilled. Blunt was not just a patient. Blunt was the one who had everything to lose. And Dr. Morley, caught in the storm of it all, had been sacrificed. The real question was why. Poirot stood there, his eyes narrowed in determination. It wasn't just about Dr. Morley anymore. It was about something much larger, something far more dangerous than a mere murder. The answers were just out of reach, but Poirot could feel them slipping closer, like the final pieces of a puzzle. And when it all came together, it would reveal a truth so dark, so twisted, it would leave them all breathless. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Poirot turned to leave, his mind already running through the possibilities, his hand on the doorknob. But before he could step outside, something caught his eye. A glint in the distanza movement so subtle, yet unmistakable. Poirot froze, his heart racing. Someone was watching him. The game had just begun. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot's breath caught in his throat as he peered through the window, a shadow crossing the alleyway outside. A figure, just beyond the line of sight, slipping away into the fog. The same figure he had seen early watching, waiting. Was it Blunt? Was someone else pulling the strings behind the scenes? The questions swirled around Poirot, louder than any answers. Without another word, Poirot turned, his resolve firm. It was time to follow the thread, and this time, there would be no turning back. As he exited the clinic, a chilling thought settled into his mind. The true game had yet to begin. Suspects and secrets unveiled. Poirot had always prided himself on the art of observation. A glance here, a pause there, the subtle play of emotion on a person's face, these were the tools of his craft. And so, as he stood in front of Alistair Blunt's sprawling townhouse, he could feel the weight of the man's presence even before the door opened. Blunt was a man who seemed impervious to scrutiny, as if every layer of his life had been meticulously guarded. But Poirot knew better. There were always cracks, tiny fissures where the truth could leak through. The question was, would Blunt reveal any of them? As Poirot entered Blunt's opulent drawing room, the air felt thick, heavy with unspoken words. Blunt stood by the fireplace, his tall, imposing figure framed by the flickering flames. He exuded an air of control, his every move deliberate, his voice a steady baritone that never betrayed a hint of nervousness. Monsieur Poirot, Blunt greeted him, his tone measured but not unkind. To what do I owe the honor of your visit? Poirot smiled, but it was the kind of smile that never quite reached his eyes. Ah, Mr. Blunt, it is not so much an honor as it is a necessity. I seek the truth, and it seems that you might know more than you are willing to share. Blunt raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement passing over his face. I am not a man who deals in secrets, Poirot. I have nothing to hide. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Is that so? A man of your stature, surely there must be enemies. The powerful often attract such attention. Blunt's expression shifted, the slightest tension creeping into his features. But he recovered quickly, the mask of composure settling back into place. You are correct. There are those who may wish me harm, but none of them have ever been close enough to do anything more than talk. Poirot's mind raced as he watched Blunt carefully. The man's words were too smooth, too rehearsed. It was almost as if he were speaking from a script, one carefully written to deflect suspicion. Miss Sainsbury Seal's disappearance. Poirot had grown accustomed to the subtle rhythms of human behavior. Each flicker of an eye, every twitch of the hand, was a clue. But nothing had prepared him for the unnerving disappearance of Miss Sainsbury Seal. The woman who had left the clinic hurriedly on the day Dr. Morley was found dead had vanished without a trace, as if the earth itself had swallowed her whole. It was as if the very air in the city had grown thicker with mystery, and Poirot could feel it closing in around him. His visit to Miss Seal's home was fruitless. The housekeeper, a stoic woman with no love lost for her employer, claimed Miss Seal had left in a hurry and had not returned since. I haven't seen her since the day of Dr. Morley's tragedy, she had muttered, eyes darting nervously to the door as though she feared someone might overhear. Poirot pressed her further, but the housekeeper only repeated herself, her answers dry and devoid of emotion. She seemed upset, sir. Not like herself. She didn't say where she was going. Poirot's mind raced. There was something more to Miss Seal's sudden flight, a deeper connection to the case that she was trying to hide. Why had she left? Was she in danger? Or was she a part of the danger herself? Gladys Neville, the frightened assistant. Poirot turned his attention to Dr. Morley's assistant, Gladys Neville, a young woman who had worked for Dr. Morley for several years. Her demeanor was always polite, but there was a nervous energy to her now that Poirot could not ignore. She seemed different, more fragile, her eyes darting about the room as though she were constantly on alert. When he visited her in the small office she shared with Dr. Morley, she appeared startled to see him. Her hands trembled as she poured him a cup of tea, the porcelain cup rattling in her grasp. "Is there something I can help you with, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice tight. Poirot studied her carefully. He could see that something was amiss: her pale complexion, the way she avoided his gaze, the subtle tremor in her voice. The image of a woman on the edge of a breaking point. He took his time, not rushing her, allowing the silence to press down on her. His every word was measured, deliberate. "Miss Neville," he said, his tone soft but firm, "I believe you know more about Dr. Morley's death than you have let on." Her eyes flickered, a brief moment of panic before she masked it with a faint smile. "I don't know what you mean, sir." Poirot leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers. "You are frightened, Miss Neville. Not just of the police, but of something else. Someone. Tell me, what is it that you are hiding?" Her breath caught in her throat. She hesitated, wringing her hands, but then she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. Overheard something. Dr. Morley, he was involved in something dangerous. I didn't know what it was, but I knew he was afraid. He started getting these strange visitors, people who were important, powerful, and they were not coming for medical treatment. Poirot's mind snapped into overdrive. "Powerful, you say? Can you tell me more?" Gladys shook her head, her eyes darting nervously to the door. "I can't. I've already said too much. You have no idea what you're getting into, Monsieur Poirot. This is bigger than you think. You must stop." "Stop?" Poirot's voice grew stern. "Monday, ami, you are in as much danger as Dr. Morley was. I will not stop until I understand the truth." A tangled web of intrigue. Poirot's investigation had taken a darker turn. The pieces were slowly coming together, but the puzzle was far more complex than he had anticipated. As he interviewed more people, he uncovered whispers of political intrigue, corrupt dealings, and hidden motives that stretched far beyond the good doctor and his patients. He learned that Dr. Morley had been working with powerful figures, men who wielded influence in the highest circles of society. There were rumors that the good doctor had been a key player in a covert operation involving high-stakes financial dealings, dirty politics, and perhaps even espionage. It was clear now that his death was not random. It had been orchestrated, planned by people who stood to lose everything if the doctor's secrets came to light. Poirot had seen this kind of thing before. Powerful people, desperate to protect their interests, would go to any lengths to keep their secrets buried. But what was the doctor involved in? And what did Miss Sainsbury Seal and Gladys Neville know about it? His head swam with possibilities, but it wasn't until that evening, as he was reflecting on the day's events in his modest apartment, that something truly chilling occurred. The anonymous warning. The letter arrived without warning slipped under his door. No return address, no signature. Poirot unfolded it, his eyes narrowing as he read the stark message. "Leave this alone, or you will regret it." The words were scrawled in haste, the ink smudged in places, as though the writer had been rushing. Poirot felt a cold chill run down his spine. Whoever had sent this was not playing games. The stakes had been raised, and the danger was now personal. For a moment, Poirot sat in silence, the weight of the message settling over him. Who had sent it? Was it one of the powerful figures Dr. Morley had been involved with? Or was it someone closer to him, someone who had something to protect, someone who feared what Poirot might uncover? He crumpled the paper in his hand, but his determination remained unshaken. If anything, this warning only fueled his resolve. Whoever was behind this, they had made one critical mistake. They had underestimated Hercule Poirot. Cliffhanger ending. Poirot stood by the window, staring out at the flickering lights of the city below. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, but one thing was certain. This case was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. But then, as if the universe itself had chosen to test him, Poirot heard a soft sound, someone knocking at his door. He froze, every muscle in his body tensing. Who could it be at this hour? A knock like that, so quiet, so measured, could only mean one thing. A visitor. Someone who knew too much. Someone who was about to change everything. Poirot moved toward the door slowly, every step echoing in the silence of his apartment. His hand rested on the knob, but for a brief moment he hesitated. What if this was the moment that changed everything? What if this was the tipping point, the moment the darkness would swallow him whole? He opened the door, and there, standing in the doorway, was Miss Sainsbury Seal, pale, disheveled, and trembling, her eyes wide with fear. "Poirot," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know. They're coming for me. You must help me, please." The door slammed shut behind her, and just like that, Poirot's world had shifted once more. Midpoint revelation. The investigation had taken a darker turn, and Poirot felt the heavy weight of the truth inching closer, a truth that promised to shatter lives. He spent hours combing through Dr. Morley's meticulous records, the doctor's neat handwriting filling the pages with notes that chronicled every patient's treatment in minute detail. Poirot knew that Dr. Morley had always been methodical, but as he turned each page he realized just how thorough the doctor had been. And then, amid the sea of seemingly mundane details, something caught Poirot's trained eye: discrepancy, buried between routine notes on dental work. It was a small detail, almost insignificant in its own right. But Poirot's mind immediately began to churn. Alistair Blunt, the wealthy banker who had been one of the last to see Dr. Morley alive, had come in for a routine dental examination just days before the doctor's death. But according to the records, something had been off. Dr. Morley had noted a subtle but unusual mark on Blunt's gums during the examination, a mark that didn't belong. Poirot's pulse quickened as the realization struck him like a lightning bolt. Dr. Morley had found something that had been hidden in plain sight. The discrepancy was not just a minor detail, it was a clue that pointed to something far more sinister. Blunt had been hiding something worth killing for. The idea lingered in Poirot's mind, chilling and elusive. What had Dr. Morley discovered? Was it blackmail, a hidden affair, or something far more dangerous? One thing was clear. Blunt was hiding the truth, and Dr. Morley had known it. Poirot made a mental note to confront Blunt soon, but the next twist in the case would take him in an unexpected direction. Discovery: Miss Sainsbury Seal's handbag. Poirot's investigation turned to Miss Sainsbury Seal, the mysterious woman who had vanished without a trace. The more he dug, the more his suspicions grew. Her hurried departure from the clinic and her sudden disappearance seemed to be connected to Dr. Morley's death in some way, but the exact nature of their connection remained elusive. Poirot had been speaking with his trusted associate, Captain Hastings, when he received an unexpected call. It was from the police. They had found something handbag, abandoned near the River Thames. The description was unmistakable. It was Miss Sainsbury Seal's. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. What was Miss Seal's handbag doing by the river? And more importantly, why hadn't anyone found it before? Poirot instructed Hastings to meet him at the scene, and they arrived to find the handbag lying abandoned on a patch of grass, the leather worn and frayed from neglect. Poirot knelt beside it, his sharp eyes scanning for any clues. He opened the bag carefully, his fingers brushing over the contents. There was a notebook, a few loose papers, and a blood-stained handkerchief, its fabric darkened with crimson. Poirot's mind raced. Was this a sign of struggle, or was it something else entirely? Why would Miss Seal's bag be found here, discarded so carelessly? Had she been involved in something far more dangerous than he had originally thought? As Poirot held the handkerchief up to the light, he could almost hear Dr. Morley's voice in his head, warning him about the risks of uncovering the truth. But it was too late for warnings now. Poirot had already stepped too far into the web of lies and deceit. Miss Sainsbury Seal had been involved in something she couldn't escape from. The question was, what had she known, and why was her bag discarded near the river? Final act. The room was thick with tension. Poirot had assembled everyone in the lavish drawing room of the clinic, the very place where Dr. Morley had spent his final days, oblivious to the treacherous forces closing in around him. It was a silent gathering, each suspect in their place, their eyes darting nervously from one person to the next, as though expecting someone else to make the first move. But Poirot remained calm, his hands neatly folded in front of him, his mind calculating. "Monday, Ami," he began, his voice carrying an unmistakable authority. "There are certain things that, no matter how carefully concealed, always come to the surface." He paused, his eyes scanning each person in the room. The truth cannot be hidden forever. The suspects shifted uneasily, but none of them spoke. Poirot continued. "I will tell you now what happened. Dr. Morley did not take his own life. He was murdered, and not for reasons anyone expected. No, this murder was part of something much larger, a web of deceit that reached into the highest corners of power." The words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Chief Inspector Japp, standing in the corner, visibly tensed. His skepticism had slowly shifted to unease, but he didn't dare interrupt. Poirot took a slow, deliberate step forward. "Dr. Morley," Poirot said, "had uncovered a plot involving espionage and financial corruption at the highest levels. The powerful man you all know as Alistair Blunt was at the center of it all. Blunt had been using his influence to manipulate international markets, all while hiding behind his respectable public persona. But Dr. Morley, a man of ethics, a man who could not ignore the truth, had stumbled upon the financial deceit, the hidden accounts, and the dangerous ties to foreign governments. When Blunt realized that Morley knew too much, he took drastic measures to silence him." The room went dead silent. It was the moment everyone had been waiting for, yet no one was prepared for the truth. Poirot paused, letting the weight of his words sink in before continuing. "But there's more," Poirot added, his gaze shifting to Miss Sainsbury Seal, who sat stiffly in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Miss Seal, the mysterious woman who vanished, had not simply run away in fear. No, her disappearance was staged, a deliberate act to mislead the investigation. You see, Miss Seal knew much more than she let on. She was involved, though she may not have fully understood the scope of what was unfolding. The day Dr. Morley was killed, Miss Seal was nearby, an eyewitness to the crime. But when she saw what had truly happened, she panicked. To protect herself, she faked her own disappearance. She was trying to run from the truth, just as you all were. Miss Seal's face had drained of color. Her eyes darted to the others in the room, her lips trembling as she tried to find her words. But Poirot wasn't done. And then there is the one person among you, the person who has been hiding in plain sight. Gladys Neville, Poirot said, his voice low and deliberate. Gladys Neville, Dr. Morley's timid assistant, seemed to shrink back in her chair as her name echoed through the room. She had kept to herself throughout the investigation, always appearing fearful and innocent, as though she couldn't possibly be involved in anything sinister. But Poirot's eyes were unyielding, and he knew that appearances could be deceiving. She, Poirot continued, is not the helpless, frightened woman she pretends to be. Number Gladys Neville is a key player in the conspiracy, manipulated, yes, but complicit nonetheless. Her fear was not of the murder itself, but of the powerful figures who had drawn her into their web. Gladys knew more than anyone about the plans being made behind closed doors, and though she was used as a pawn in their game, she was no innocent bystander. The timid woman you all thought was harmless. She is the one who delivered the information Dr. Morley had uncovered to the very people who would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Gladys's face contorted with fear and shame, her hands trembling as she looked around the room, trying to make sense of the accusation. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Why, Gladys?" Poirot asked, his voice soft but piercing. "Why involve yourself in this treachery?" Tears welled up in Gladys's eyes, and she broke down, her fragile composure shattering in an instant. "I didn't have a choice," she whispered, her voice trembling. "They threatened me. They said they'd ruin me. They said they'd make sure I'd never see another day in peace." Poirot's gaze softened for a moment, but he didn't allow himself to be swayed. He knew that fear had its way of controlling people, but it didn't absolve them of their actions. "But you could have turned to the authorities," Poirot countered. "You could have done something to stop it." Gladys sobbed, her face contorted in guilt. "I was too scared. I thought if I helped, I'd be safe. I never imagined it would end like this. I never thought Dr. Morley would be murdered." The room fell into a tense silence. Poirot, ever the master of observation, took a step back, letting the weight of the truth settle upon the group. The conspiracy had been exposed, but there was still so much left to uncover. Cliffhanger ending. Before Poirot could speak again, the door to the drawing room slammed open. All eyes turned as a figure stepped into the room. Alistair Blunt, the man at the center of it all. But his entrance was not triumphant. His face was pale, his steps slow, as if he had just received a shock. "Poirot," Blunt's voice cracked. "You're too late. They're coming for you." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and he took a step toward Blunt, his voice unwavering. "Who, Blunt? Who is coming for me?" Blunt opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a sharp noise echoed from outside, gunshots, rapid and piercing. The sound of chaos filled the air, and the room erupted into pandemonium. Poirot's mind raced. The game was not yet over. The web had grown larger, and more dangerous forces were closing in. "Come," Poirot said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "We must act quickly. There is no time left." The final act had begun, but where would it lead? And who would survive the deadly game that had been set into motion? Climax. The room was alive with chaos. The shots had rang out only moments ago, echoing through the grand clinic. Poirot, ever calm, gestured for the group to remain still, but the tension was palpable. A quick look at Blunt, whose face had drained of color, told Poirot everything. There was something more at play here, something far darker than anyone had anticipated. "Blunt," Poirot said, his voice cutting through the noise. "You are not the one pulling the strings. No, monsieur, the real mastermind is still hiding in the shadows." Blunt, still rattled, stepped back, his expression a mixture of confusion and disbelief. "What do you mean?" he stammered. "Tu had no part in this. I'm just a victim here, just like you." Poirot's piercing gaze held Blunt's, unflinching. The detective's mind worked quickly, piecing together the final clues. He'd known something didn't add up. The conspiracy was more than espionage and financial corruption. It was a carefully orchestrated plan to destabilize the very fabric of the nation's financial system. "Alistair Blunt," Poirot continued, his voice steady. "You were being used, but not for your influence. No, someone closer to you was the true orchestrator of the scheme." Blunt's brow furrowed. Who? Who could it be? Poirot took a slow, deliberate step toward the table in the center of the room. There, sitting beneath a pile of discarded papers, lay a letter, its edges frayed, its seal broken. The handwriting was unmistakable. Yet it didn't belong to Blunt. It was familiar, from someone who had been in the shadows all along. "Miss Sainsbury's seal," Poirot said, looking directly at the person who had been the most elusive throughout the investigation. She was not the victim as we all thought. No, she was never in danger. She had staged her disappearance, knowing the truth would make her a target. Gasps echoed around the room. The entire investigation had been based on the assumption that Miss Seal was either dead or on the run. But Poirot had seen through the layers of deception. "Why?" Blunt whispered, his voice hoarse. "Why would she do this?" "Miss Sainsbury's Seal," Poirot answered, "was a trusted associate, a woman of means, connected to those who sought to profit from the nation's downfall. She worked for an even higher caution, rooted in greed, in power, and the person she was protecting was none other than her own superior, a man with far greater ambitions than Blunt ever imagined." The room went silent. Miss Seal, hidden in plain sight as an innocent victim, was revealed to be a master manipulator. But who was her superior? Who had been pulling her strings? Suddenly, the door to the room swung open, and a figure stepped forward. Miss Sainsbury's Seal, alive and standing tall, entered with an air of confidence that was almost chilling. Her eyes gleamed as if she had been watching the entire confrontation unfold from the shadows. Poirot's gaze locked with hers. "Ah, Miss Seal," Poirot began, his voice almost a whisper. "You had us all fooled, didn't you? You made us believe you were merely a victim in this tragic affair, but in truth, you were the key player, the one who pulled the threads that unraveled Dr. Morley's life." Miss Seal smiled, a cold, calculating smile. "You are a clever man, Hercule Poirot," she said, her voice smooth, "but not clever enough." Poirot took a step back, his eyes narrowing as the truth began to settle in. "You're not working alone, are you? This plot was bigger than just financial gain. It was about power. And you were merely a tool for someone else, someone who could see the potential of bringing an empire to its knees." She nodded slowly, her expression distant, as though recalling a memory long buried. "You have no idea what's at stake, Poirot. We were going to expose the system that has been corrupt for decades. Morley found out about it. He wasn't supposed to." Miss Seal's words hung in the air, a chilling admission. The conspiracy wasn't about personal revenge or a simple financial crime. It was about the greater collapse of an entire system. And Dr. Morley had been in the way. But there was something else, something more sinister. Miss Seal's eyes flicked to a corner of the room. Poirot's heart skipped a beat. "Not yet, Miss Seal," Poirot warned, his mind racing. "Who is the mastermind? Who is the one who manipulated you?" Before she could respond, a loud crash rang out from the hallway, loud, frantic footsteps racing toward the door. The atmosphere shifted immediately. Poirot's eyes widened as he realized the danger was far from over. "Get out!" a voice screamed from the doorway. "They're coming!" At the very moment Miss Seal opened her mouth to speak again, a figure appeared at the doorway, a shadowy man, holding a revolver aimed directly at Poirot. "Move, Poirot," the man commanded, his voice hard, cold. "This is bigger than you think." But Poirot, never one to be intimidated, stood his ground. His eyes locked on the figure, unwavering. "You are too late," Poirot said quietly. "The truth is already here." With the gunman's attention diverted for a split second, Poirot moved swiftly, his hand reaching for a hidden button under the table. The sound of a hidden door opening echoed through the room, revealing a passage leading to a hidden study. And standing there, alive and well, was the man who had orchestrated it all. But it was too late to stop Poirot now. The web was fully unraveled, and the truth would be exposed. Final revelation. Poirot turned to the man standing in the doorway. "You, monsieur," he began with a chilling calm, "are the true mastermind. The one who sought to manipulate and destroy the financial fabric of this nation for your own gain." The man's face twisted in anger and fear. "You think you've won, Poirot. You have no idea what you've started." Poirot's expression softened, but his words were firm. "Ah, the truth. It is a most dangerous thing. But always it must be found." And with that, the final confrontation began. Cliffhanger ending. As the man lunged toward Poirot, the entire room seemed to tremble. The conspirators were collapsing around him, but the truth would never be so simple. The final battle for the nation's fate was about to unfold, and the question remained, who would survive to see the light of day?